So my name is Amos Schonfield. I am, amongst many things, a serial Limmudnik and the founder and director of Our Second Home, which is the UK's youth movement for refugees and asylum seekers. It is a pleasure to speak today with Lord Alf Dubs, who has kindly urged me to not use the honorific too much, so that will be the last time. Just by way of introduction, Alf arrived in the UK as a child refugee in the Kinder Transport as one of some 700 children saved by Sir Nicholas Winton. Alf's public service career began as a local councillor and later as an MP for Battersea between 1979 and 1987. Then he became the director of the Refugee Council for 7 years and was appointed to the House of Lords in 1994. In that time, he was a minister in the Northern Ireland office under Mo Mowlam between 1997 and 1999, and any students of recent history will know that that was the time of the Good Friday Agreement. He has been among the most effective and high-profile peers in the House of Lords, particularly since 2016, when the campaign to adopt an amendment to the government's immigration bill succeeded, ensuring that through what is now known as the Dubs scheme, that the UK will accept many unaccompanied refugee children stranded on the continent by the so-called refugee crisis. I've heard Alf address audiences great and small, and each time his combination of humility, grit, and empathy leaves me more knowledgeable and more inspired than I was before. So Alf, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Amos.
I wanted to start by separating out the rhetoric and the facts. The government has long tried many tricks to make people seeking sanctuary seem like a menace. There has been crisis after crisis. There has been different policies proposed. What is the actual situation facing refugees coming to the UK today?
Well, the difficulty is that we've had hostile statements by ministers. And could I say at the outset that my campaign, any campaigning I've done on behalf of child refugees, has not been for any one political party. I've tried to get support across the political spectrum. However, in answer to your question, when you have government ministers who say their main aim is to keep people out, whether it's people from Europe before Brexit, or whether it's people who are coming on the back of lorries, or more recently on the dangerous sea crossing across the Channel from France. If the signal is we don't want these people here, it has a poisoning effect on local communities. Because if ministers say we're going to keep these people out and shove the boats away or whatever it is, then in local communities, good nature, good relationships suffer. So I think that's a very sad thing to have happened. It used not to be like that, but it's been getting worse. It's not been wonderful in all our history, but it actually has been, I fear, changing for the worse in the recent past, and that is damaging to our reputation as a country. It's damaging to the policies we follow, and above all, it's damaging to good relations in local communities.
You once said that had you been a child refugee today, that you would have been stuck in Calais yourself. How you were telling me earlier as well about the monument in Parliament, which I found fascinating. How have things changed in terms of the relationships, perhaps, or the dynamic between refugee communities and the government?
Well, let me say this, that at a local level, it is still possible for there to be good relations between refugees who arrived and local communities. And I've been in many parts of the country, and I've talked to people who've been active in providing such support, people who wanted to establish good relations. But against that, on the other side, they have a government policies are hostile. You know, unfortunately, when we had the Brexit referendum, when Boris Johnson, who was before he became Prime Minister, said that if we joined the EU, 70 to 80 million Turks would arrive in Britain, that was a complete fabrication. And Nigel Farage with his posters implying lots of people were coming. And unfortunately, that had an effect on the way people perceived the Brexit debate and how they perceived people from other countries. And I think that is very sad. And of course, although the Brexit debate was about people using freedom of movement to come to Britain from EU countries, in fact, of course, by a small extension, it then became the other. Whether the other are people from, I don't know, Romania or Hungary or somewhere, or the other from Syria or Afghanistan or wherever, the other, and they're the ones that were not desirable here. So we've got a real conflict, and my particular aim is to get as much public support as possible. The only way we can have a sensible policy on refugees is to say public opinion has got to be told what the situation is. If people know what refugees went through, what they suffered, the dangers, the fears, the terror that affected them, the dangerous journeys, if they knew that, they become more sympathetic, particularly to children. Who make up a large proportion of the refugees, people become more sympathetic. But we have to tell the story, and we have to tell it in a balanced and unemotional way. And many people do understand, but unfortunately, there are other voices from the centre that are trying to persuade people in a different direction.
You were talking about being people empathizing particularly with children. I think that's been a hallmark of, the sort of the work that you've been doing. And also is part of your own story, as we said at the beginning, that you came as part of the kinder transport, you came as a child refugee. Do you find that being someone who has that experience, and I've done many activities where people talk about the most famous refugees they can think of, and you are normally somewhere in that list, within the top 10, normally next to Mo Farah and people like that. I can see many similarities between the two of you. What is it that, your personal experience, do you find that having that personal experience is an important part of your work?
Well, let me put it this way. I believe the argument for being humanitarian, the argument for supporting refugees, does not have to depend upon the personal background of the individual putting forward the argument. However, it would be less than straightforward of me if I said I'm not emotionally involved through my background. And so when I meet a boy of 15 or 16 who's come from halfway across the world for safety, I have some empathy. I have some feeling that I understand some of what he went through. Mind you, I was at a meeting in Parliament some years ago with people who'd survived the Holocaust, people who'd been in the camps and managed to survive. And they said, what was I doing there? And I said, well, I came on a kinder transport. And they said, oh, wonderful. I said, no, compared to you, that was a mere nothing. I got on a train and 48 hours later arrived at Liverpool Street. What you went through was incomparably, immeasurably worse and worse. And what some of the young refugees coming or seeking to come here at the moment, they had long journeys. They may not have been fleeing the Holocaust, but they've been fleeing war, torture, persecution, and so on. And they've had frighteningly long journeys. Some people, the young people, have traveled 6 months or a year to get even to the Channel coast. And they feel if they've got a connection with this country, this is where they want to be.
And we've been dancing around this. Of course, Limmud is a Jewish organization, Jewish festival, festival of Jewish learning, and meeting with Holocaust survivors and discussing experiences of being othered. These are all part of the sort of Jewish community in the UK, our experience of welcoming in people through the kinder transport, of having many of our ancestors, very recent ancestors, being Holocaust survivors, certainly being alive in that time and feeling the precariousness of that experience. How has that experience been for you of working with the Jewish community on this issue of collaborating, of campaigning with the Jewish community?
Well, interesting question. I think the faith communities in general, but the Jewish community in particular, has embraced the cause of refugees, child refugees, in an overwhelming fashion. The first time I went to the jungle in Calais, about 12 of us, and that was including 5 rabbis. 5 rabbis in one go. Well, that's not bad. But really, the commitment of the Jewish community, whether it's asking me to speak in synagogues or whether it's asking me to speak at events sponsored by synagogues or other Jewish organizations, it's been absolutely overwhelming. incredibly supportive, bearing in mind a lot of these refugees are Muslims, and it just shows a sense of humanity, a sense of tolerance, and a sense of wanting to help vulnerable people, which is both wonderful and is also humbling. And one can't say that enough. And as I say, I found the support of the Jewish community really tremendous. And there are two things they have. They have a hunger to know what the facts are and what's going on. And secondly, they have a hunger to say to me, what can we do to help? What can we do to help? And those are the two great things that I try and help them move along with.
I think, from what I've been in many meetings with other sort of mid-level workers within the refugee advocacy community, and there are lots of people who I meet. We could probably have a minion and have, there are a number of Jews in every meeting, and sort of several people in my position who have started refugee organizations inspired by the increased prominence of refugee issues recently. And when you say that people ask what can they do you think, is there anything that people have been reluctant to do? Has there been tension that I think where we could push people further?
No, I think it's a matter of advising people who may not have a strong or long background in politics, advising people as to how they can exert their influence. Because I say to them, any audience, I say, you're part of public opinion. And it is public opinion that tipped the balance in favor of my amendment some years ago. And it's public opinion which will try and move our country in a more humanitarian direction. And if people I talk to, and we're talking about the Jewish community here, if they are willing to do some hard lobbying, that can be influential. They can talk to politicians, whether they're national politicians or whether they're local MPs or whether they're local councillors. All of these are places where they can exert an influence, as well as in other organisations of which they're members. I think it's important that even people who are sympathetic are kept up to date with what's going on, so that they know what the situation is. It's easy, for nerds in Parliament, it's easy enough for me to keep sort of up to date. But for other people, it's more difficult. Parliament's a very complicated place, and it's not always as transparent as it should be. So I regard it as my mission to help, because the people who are keenest are children, schools themselves. I love talking to schools. I've talked to a number of schools. So I've talked to some Jewish schools, and they are so committed and passionate in this, and I can hardly stop them rushing off to Calais to help as volunteers. So, and that's very heartening. And young people understand this. They understand it better than older ones.
I think that's wonderful. There was a time when Calais became almost a weekend destination. I remember it in around 2017, 2016, and I think there's this. There was this urge that we knew we needed to do something, but we didn't know what. And I think how do we address this in a sort of in a systemic way? One of the things I want to talk about is a bill going through Parliament at the moment, and it's certainly been a difficult process for me to look at. The Nationality and Borders Bill, it's a systemic approach to dealing with refugees. It just happens to be a very difficult one. So what are some of the things that are being discussed within that bill and that you're hearing at the moment in terms of how to address it?
Yes. Can I just say one thing about Calais? Would you mind if I jump back a bit?
I would love to. I'm fascinated by Calais.
Okay, well, I've been to Calais several times. I've been to Greek islands. I've been to a refugee camp in Jordan. So I do that because I think it enables me to hear it firsthand what refugees are saying and thinking and feeling. And therefore, it enables me to talk about refugees, I think, with a little bit more authenticity than if I simply get it from the more sympathetic newspapers. We have a few sympathetic newspapers, mostly they're not. But the first time I went to Calais was when the jungle had only been half cleared. It's since been totally cleared. And in the shopping street, walking down the middle, there were displays of tear gas canisters and rubber bullets. And I said, what are they for? And I was told that the then French government used those to clear the first refugees from the first half of the camp. And I said, well, these are refugees. How can they be using tear gas canisters and rubber bullets on them? And they said, well, the then French government was very worried about the activities of the National Front in that part of northern France. And they were trying to show how tough they were. And all I could comment on was to say that you don't defeat fascism by behaving like fascists. And I found that very shocking. On the positive side, I found that there were volunteers working in Calais and on the Greek islands and so on, young people who had given up a year or two of their lives to help their more vulnerable fellow human beings. And I thought that was pretty terrific. And these people don't get many accolades, they don't get much praise, and we should remember them as people who really are doing a fantastic job. And in very difficult circumstances, and they're still there now in what's left of the jungle. So I jumped a bit away from the bill.
No, let's stick with this actually, because I think we'll move to the bill in a bit, because I'm interested in. There's a perception that people like you and me are sort of quite naive in our refugee advocacy work, and that'll be the last time I try and compare myself to you, because it sounded silly coming out of my mouth. There's been questions in already coming through in the Q&A about exactly about what you said before regarding the issue of anti-Semitism, the issue of a strange feature that the Jews are advocating for people who are often coming from Muslim majority countries, and in incidents where attacks on Jews, this is a question that I've seen come through, where attacks on Jews in the UK, France and Germany have come from refugees coming from Muslim majority countries. How do we address that kind of critique when it comes through?
Well, it's quite difficult, but look, when I say critique, I mean, I think it's a fantastic tribute to the Jewish community that they're going out of their way, I think probably more than any other faith group, going out of their way to support people who are not Jewish and who have an entirely different background. And I think that's I think that's important, and it's a sign that some of us in this country, or some communities in this country, are really humanitarian and believe in the values of decency and in supporting their fellow human beings. But can I just break off there and just tell you a little story? I was asked to speak at a school in East London. It was a school in Tower Hamlets, and it wasn't a religious school. I mean, it was a maintained school, but it was all Muslims. I could tell it was all Muslim boys. And their project, and I was asked to help in the project, their project was kinder transport and the Holocaust. And then we did the Q&A, and the first Q&A question from a 14-year-old Muslim boy was, what do I say to people who deny the Holocaust ever happened? And I thought that was a fantastic question, coming from a Muslim boy in a Muslim school in a predominantly Muslim part of London. And it was a fantastic question, and it's a sign that school was doing something pretty good, because it was actually challenging them in a way in which they probably weren't being challenged in their day-to-day experience. And I thought that was a great tribute to the school and to education, as I would praise the Holocaust Education Trust for the work they do as well in spreading the word and so on. So there are a lot of really good things happening, and they're happening across the religious divides. So they're happening by people who are not of the same faith as the refugees, but they're doing it to support them. And I think these are all positive things which you should never forget when we talked about the gloom and doom of our Home Secretary.
It definitely echoes something that I've experienced, what you were describing. The organisation that I started with, Our Second Home, is run often by many of the senior people involved in that are Jews. And we support young refugees who often are Muslims. We have Muslims and Christians and people who have strong faith and none. And one of the it's certainly not an aim of ours, but certainly something that happens, is that these people get to meet a Jewish person for the first time in their life, and it often, despite they never really often will come with sort of strange stereotypes, and often fairly, to be true, fairly anti-Semitic things that they might be coming from, but it's from a place of ignorance rather than a place of sort of malevolence. And one of the main benefits that we found with those kinds of people is that they end up coming away with a completely different view. how often when you're doing your work is your Jewishness front and center, or your Jewish background front and center, and how often is it not?
Let me be quite honest, though. I'm of that odd species. My father was Jewish, my mother wasn't. And when I was explaining this to a Jewish American, he said, "But you're not Jewish at all." And I said, "Well, maybe not in those terms, but the Nazis thought I was." And he said, "There's no answer to that." Look, no, I mean, people are interested. They ask me about my background, and they try and see if my background relates to the experiences of refugees today, and how and they ask me the earlier question you asked me about how I'm influenced by this. So I think in the end we have the background, we have the experiences, we have the beliefs we have, and we try and apply those in a humanitarian way, and politics is a good vehicle for that. For me, it's not an only vehicle. There are other vehicles, but it's a way in which I believe I can do a few things. Look, there's no point in being involved in politics if you don't try and make a difference. It's about making a difference. Otherwise, why be there at all? And so but equally there are other causes I've been involved with, but people have been more interested in this one, and I think they've been more interested in this one because the media picked up my background, and that helped the media in terms of projecting the whole story, and I used not to talk about my Kindertransport background. I never denied it, but I never boasted about it. It was just a thing in my past. But then it became a sort of important part of the story. And I think one thing I noticed very quickly was this: that because I came as an unaccompanied child refugee, it became harder for the government to criticize unaccompanied child refugees too much, because it looked like a personal attack on me. And that sort of didn't go down. In British politics that doesn't normally go down too well. Maybe it does nowadays, but it didn't then. Anyway, so in a way, I found that politically helpful. But it wasn't my invention. It was the media that introduced that, as the media introduced Nicky Winton. I knew I'd come on a Kindertransport. I knew nothing about Nicky Winton till he appeared on those television programs, and then I got to know him, and he was a great guy. Absolutely great guy. And I got to know him pretty well. Exciting man, interesting, and a committed man. So he and I used to chat about politics quite a lot. He loved doing that. So these are all bits of the background, anyway.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you. I think something that you mentioned is when the Dubs Amendment came through, and it was one of those at that time. Getting the government to U-turn was less common than it was later on, and it was because of public pressure. That it came at a time when public opinion about refugees, and especially child refugees, was changing. How did that happen, and is there a way that we can recreate that we can get back to a time when refugees were seen in a positive light, at least for a moment?
Well, of course, they were seen in a more positive light in the immediate post-war period, and then gradually over the years they became seen in a less positive light. But I do think the tipping point was the Brexit referendum. I'm an unashamed Remainer on that, but I respect people's views. But the Brexit referendum, take back control, in my experience, and I've knocked on as many doors as anybody you'll meet, campaigning to remain, the take back control meant keep them out. That's what it began, and it is a very quick, short step from keeping out other EU citizens to keeping out other people. It was just part of the overall message, and we are working, and we've had to work to bring back the more decent approach, which was lost at that time. I'm sorry, I feel quite strongly about that. I think it poisoned the atmosphere, unnecessarily so, but it poisoned the atmosphere because people advocating it were trying to poison the atmosphere, and it was very, very sad. And what we've got to do, and I believe firmly, we've got to explain what it means to be a refugee, what it implies in terms of what they've escaped from, the lack of hope, losing family, the fear, losing relatives, the dangers, and the hope of trying to build a new life. And these are all part of the refugee experience. And the more we can get people to understand and respect that, the better it will be for all of us.
With that, I want to come back to the topic that we abandoned for greener pastures before, perhaps because it's quite awkward, which is the Nationality and Borders Bill. The Borders Bill is this government's sort of attempt at sort of continuing its promise to end freedom of movement, which was something that was one of the few things they could get out of the Brexit referendum, was to say we're going to do this. Now, the Borders Bill criminalizes people who seek sanctuary. It criminalizes people who try to aid them as well. Is this as aggressive as I'm describing? Is it an aggressive bill that tries to do dramatic things? Or are we getting worried over nothing?
We're certainly not getting worried over nothing. This is the most serious attack on the rights of refugees and the 1951 Geneva Convention that I think there has ever been. Certainly by this country. I think the bill will undermine the position of refugees. It will criminalize them. I'm not going to. I don't want to summarize the whole bill, and it actually represents a breach of the Geneva Convention. Now, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, after all, is a body that I think has custody of the 1951 Geneva Convention, and they're very clear about how the bill breaches the convention to criminalize people who don't come by sort of a legal route. Now, how can most of these people come by a legal route when the legal routes have been closed? And the government says they want to deal with people traffickers. Well, people traffickers get business when there are no legal paths to safety. Where there are legal paths to safety, the traffickers don't get the business. So, and I think the government, to penalise refugees for the method of travel, making it harder for them to get refugee status if they come in the only way they can, some of them, that is surely reprehensible. The government saying that refugees should claim asylum in the first safe country they get to. I'm not sure that's specifically in the bill, but it'll come up in the debates on the bill. Doesn't make any sense. Look, if that were the case, then and it's not in the Geneva Convention, by the way, if that were the case, then instead of 1 million Syrians going to Germany, they would all be in Greece, Italy, and Malta. In practical terms, it wouldn't work, and in principle, it is wrong. And we can't have the government sort of playing havoc with the Geneva Convention, playing havoc with international principles, just because it suits it. And we're talking about small numbers. When Germany took 1 million, Angela Merkel took 1 million Syrians in 2015, 16, 17, Angela Merkel pleaded with other countries to help. Well, some made noises, but very few actually did anything tangible. We didn't. And later on, there were some tangible offers of help. But on the whole, the European Commission has asked other countries to share responsibility, and there's been a limited response more recently. And I think that is the right way forward. But we've got to bear in mind that the majority, when they say why don't they stay in France, the government says why don't they stay in France? Well, the fact is the majority do claim asylum when they get to France. They do stay in France. It's a minority that seek to come here. Why do they do that? Usually because they have some connection with this country, maybe language, maybe education in the past, maybe family. And family reunion has been one of the strongest drivers of people wanting to come here. If somebody has a brother or an uncle here and they're sitting in France, what more natural thing than they want to join them? I knew of one Syrian boy who was stuck in Greece, and his brother in northern England said he'll welcome him. He's got somewhere for him to live. It took a lot of effort to get that to happen, and usually doesn't even succeed. So we're talking about people who have a good, decent humanitarian reason. Bearing in mind the vast majority of the refugees don't get to Europe at all. Look, when people say to me, "What's the position?" I say, "Well, look, there are 3 to 4 million in Turkey and 1 million each in Lebanon and Jordan." And we're arguing about small numbers. And people say, well, the country's full. There are too many people in this country. We've got labor shortages all over the place. We're not full at all. And indeed, employers crying out for labour, not able to provide a service because they can't get the workers that they want for their businesses or their shops and things. So these are, and then the people say, well, we can't afford to look after child refugees. Well, I say we're one of the richest countries in the world. Surely we can afford to do that. We shouldn't make the refugees the victims of policies that are trying to cut back money for local government. That's getting very political, huh?
No, I think that's fascinating, and it reminds me of whenever people of your persuasion when it came to Brexit, Remainers were told that they were talking down Britain whenever we would talk about the realities of a political situation may put us in. And it always strikes me that the same people who are angry about talking down Britain are the same ones that claim that we can't support 10,000 people arriving, 20,000 people arriving every year in a country with a population of 60 to 70 million. That we can't possibly do our utmost to maintain that proud history of compassion and welcome. I think it is something that for better and worse we claim as part of our history is welcoming refugees. Indeed, welcoming refugees from your generation, from the kinder transport. So I think it's one of these things that, at least in theory, is a winnable argument. It's that when it gets to the practicality, perhaps it becomes more of a challenge.
Yes. Well, we just have to use every argument we can, use opportunities like this one you've given today, and try and spread the word and get people enthusiastic, not just about believing what we're talking about is good, but also believing that they can help and they can make a difference. And everybody listening, everybody on this can actually make a difference if they want to. I mean, all they bluntly have to do is to talk to their MP. If the MP is sympathetic, pat them on the back and saying keep going. And if the MP is not sympathetic, have a gentle, friendly discussion with them. But my plea is this: please don't feel you should only talk to your MP if he or she is sympathetic. It's more important to talk to the ones who are not sympathetic. Otherwise, they think there's no pressure. There's no pressure in the direction in which we want to exert the pressure. So and sometimes I say to people, hold your nose and talk to your MP. If your MP is unsympathetic, it's even more important. And your local councillors. Look, the local elections coming up in May, or in many places in May. Politicians are never so susceptible to arguments as when they're looking for votes. So, it's a good thing to talk to local councillors, because local councillors have an influence on the politics of the locality anyway, and of their party and of their MPs, and secondly, they can make positive decisions on behalf of refugees as regards what the local authority can do. So these are all ways in which people can have an influence, and that's good.
Absolutely. So you mentioned MPs and you mentioned local councillors. There's one other part that I wanted to raise, and this is a question from Emma Brand, which is that do you feel at all optimistic about what the Lords can do to amend the Nationality and Borders Bill? It is now with the Lords.
Right. Well, because I should have said that the second reading of the Nationality and Borders Bill is on January the 5th. I'm working on my speech for that occasion. The Commons didn't dent the bill at all. Indeed, the government introduced a few extra measures which weren't even properly debated in the Commons. Now, admittedly, the numbers the government have been putting in more people, more Tories to stop there being an anti-government majority in the Lords. However, I still believe that if we put the arguments clearly, positively, and humanely, that we can defeat the government on some of these measures by amending the bill. Okay. The question is then what happens when it gets back to the Commons. In the past, when the government didn't have such a big majority in the Commons as they now have, it was possible to actually amend the bill in the Lords, and then it would stick in the Commons. Although, interestingly, my first amendment was first defeated in the Commons, went back to the Lords, bigger majority, and then the government conceded because of public opinion. That's to say, Theresa May, who was Home Secretary, summoned me in the first time to ask me to drop my amendment, which I said I can't, because she said if these children come, others will follow. And I said we can't turn our backs on young people who are sleeping rough who are in the jungle in Calais or whatever, going through terrible experiences, vulnerable to criminality, to prostitution, to drugs, and trafficking. But then the second time the Lords passed it, the Theresa May summoned me in again and said, look, we propose to accept your amendment. They then did very niggardly about it, and instead of several thousand, which had been the original intention, they cut it, they stopped it at 480. But however, I think I think we'll have a battle on our hands to let any Lords amendments stick. But the most important thing is we've got to pass them in the Lords first, and then that sets the tone for further debate in the Commons, which is where your audience will be able to come in.
One of the things that may come up as an amendment or may, well, feature as part of the discussion is a question here from Helen Lewis, which says, how can we encourage the government to allow refugees and asylum seekers to work? We need them, and it would enable people to see the huge value any of them can bring. Yeah. Why is it not possible?
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely, as the questioner rightly has said, refugees come, and it takes a long time for them to be allowed to work. They don't want social security. I've met so many. What they want, those that are young enough want desperately to catch up on their education they've missed through the upheavals they've been through. And if they're old enough, they want to work. I've had people begging. They said, please help us to learn English. And then we want jobs. We've got skills. We've got skills to offer in local communities. And it is absolutely ridiculous that we insist that people should be forcibly unemployed, given very little sustenance to help them, and then have them behave like this when there are people willing to offer them jobs. I mean, the government are worried that if they get a job, then they'll be hard to remove. Well, you know, that's an argument I just think is a rather reprehensible argument. I think when people have the wish to work and there are jobs for them, then what is more sensible than to match willing people to job vacancies and make refugees feel they're contributing? And so many of the refugees, overwhelmingly, they say, we want to contribute to our country, to our new country. We want to contribute to it, and we can do it by working, paying our taxes, and making our way. Overwhelmingly, they say that.
So there's a question here from Brian Ratner, that says that there seemed to be a moment in the summer when Afghans were perceived positively as Afghanistan was retaken by the Taliban. And just for my addendum, there was a similar time 5-6 years ago with the Syrians as well. How might this positivity towards those refugees be capitalized on more generally?
Well, I think the argument on behalf of refugees, the one we've been discussing, had its sharpest focus when we saw what was happening when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and I think the West behaved badly in not helping people who had a fear, particularly the women with no educational opportunities left, not helping them to get out. Anyway, that's to do with American policy and Trump and Biden's policies. Look, a refugee is a refugee who's fled because they have a well-founded fear of persecution in terms of torture, imprisonment, all the other horrible things that have been happening to them. And the Afghans represent the sharpest edge of this. But the others, after all, people were fleeing, young men were fleeing the Taliban long before the Taliban took over the whole country. And I said, why? Why are you fleeing? Why have you fled? And they said, well, because the Taliban wanted to recruit me into their fighting forces. I didn't want to fight for the Taliban, so my family helped me to get out, which is why so many of them are young men, because that was the fear. Now the fear in Afghanistan is women. But in a wider sense, Syrians have been through. I mean, I talked to a Syrian boy. He said to me he'd seen his father blown to pieces in front of him by a bomb either in Aleppo or Damascus. How can a human being see their father killed in front of them? And without their life being scarred forever by this experience? And the least we can do is to offer them some safety, education, and in the case of children, if they get fostered, some of the love and affection that they've missed on their long and fearful journeys. So all refugees, in a sense, have had similarly awful experiences, even if in detail they were different. but the Afghans are the ones who are the most recent, and therefore they got more publicity, and quite rightly so.
There's been a couple of questions, because I think that the stories that you've described here of people's the situations that people are fleeing and the journeys that they've faced are harrowing. There's been a couple of questions here from Sharon Hassan and Graham Newman that sort of hit at similar issues. One is about the argument that Arab states should take more refugees. One is about us, democratic countries, the UN, putting sanctions on the states that are sending refugees, origin countries. I think the question, the overarching is why aren't we focusing on those issues, on those sort of solutions, perhaps, or international diplomatic, as opposed to, the situations that of when people are here.
Well, I think we have to do both. A human being, if he happens to have got to Europe seeking safety, then a human being is a human being with a life to lead, and we have to try and help them. But in terms of the causes of refugees, look, there are 1 million Rohingyas who fled Myanmar and are now in southern Bangladesh. We don't hear about them because the television cameras seldom get there. So there are probably about 70 million people in the world. About half of them are refugees who fled for safety to another country, and about half of them have fled for safety in their own country. There are millions. We're seeing what is still the tip of the iceberg here. Well, my belief is, and our not being in the EU weakens our ability to be influential in this. My belief is that all European countries should have an agreed humane policy on refugees, share responsibility, and then we'd all be part of this. I've never said we can take them all. I've said we should simply, as a country, share in the responsibility. The Germans have done more than share in responsibility. But if we take the Muslim countries, I said earlier, if you take Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, there are 5 or 6 million refugees in those countries. There are 1 million Rohingyas in Bangladesh. So we're dealing with pretty small numbers. And we're not going to be, Britain is not going to sink into the sea if the numbers go up a bit, because we can well readily cope, provided we have the proper local approach in local communities to make people feel welcome.
So it's very interesting to see the local sort of meet with the global there, and how at every scale we can integrate a solution together, basically, by working together. There's a question that came actually right near the beginning, and I think it's because it's one of the things that's been on the forefront of people's minds, from Helena Goldwater. At the start of at the end of November, there was the horrific incident in which 27 people died on the Channel, and of course this year Channel crossings have been by orders of magnitude more frequent than in previous years. So Helena's question is, how should the migrant crossings on dinghies be managed?
Right. Well, it's a really good question. First of all, in the past, in the fairly recent past, people crossing the Channel did so in the back of a lorry mainly, and some tragic incidents came to light. People locked in the back of a lorry and asphyxiated. The publicity, the numbers about possibly fewer coming across the Channel than were coming in the back of a lorry, but they've attracted more publicity because they're more visible in terms of the television cameras. And should I say, incidentally, that one of the reasons British public opinion kicked in so well when I started moving my amendment is because of the horrific scenes on television of ships, dinghies sinking in the Mediterranean, and that Syrian boy Alan Kurdi drowned on the Mediterranean beach. Now the question is, how should we manage the people coming over from France? Well, there's several things we can do. First of all, we can't go on having this hostile relationship with France. We've got to have good relationships with our neighbours. It's one of the tragedies of Brexit that we don't have as many friends in the EU as we used to have. Nevertheless, we've got to do this in cooperation with the French. Point number one. Point number two, we've got to have legal routes to safety. In other words, look, if there are in the past, if there was a Syrian boy in Calais who had an uncle in Birmingham, there was under European treaty called the Dublin Treaty, there was a method by which that boy could apply, refugee boy could apply to join relatives here. And that up to a point it worked. We had to push it. And indeed, one of the other amendments I argued for and got through in the 2017 legislation was that when we left the EU, we should negotiate to continue the treaty, the Dublin Treaty, whereby a refugee child in one EU country can join relatives in another. And the government had to accept that in 2017. They then deleted it in 2019, so it isn't there anymore. And the government, and in this latest bill, they're closing down the paths to safety even more. So I think a sensible government should say to the French, look, can we talk about this? We want good relations with you. We want to help you in this. It's a difficult problem for you. We want to help you. And what we'd like to do is to say, can we together, with the help of UNHCR, identify young people who've got some links with Britain, whether it's through education, language, or above all through family, and let us say to the French, come on, let's take them. Let's not have them sitting there in Calais. Let's just take them, and we'll take them, and let's have a proper relationship. These are elements of what I would like to do, instead of this slagging off the French all the time. No, they haven't behaved well either. You know, they behaved badly too. But I mean, for example, not allowing the Home Secretary to go to the meeting of European Interior Ministers. Now, that was, I thought, unnecessarily childish. But nevertheless, we've got to have a good relationship with France. I actually personally like France. I love going to France. Well, I used to when it was allowed. And I think what we've got to do is to establish a better relationship. And the quid pro quo is you help us deal with the traffickers, or we'll help you with the traffickers. But let's together identify the children, particularly the children, that we're willing to take and bring them over to Britain. That reduces the pressure in the Calais area anyway.
This brings to another question. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll try and see if we can get a few more questions in. This question from Gordon Kay that says, are there good examples of countries that are welcoming refugees and benefiting nations, which we can use to make the case and to convince others?
Well, I think Germany did for a long time, although they paid the price in terms of the election of some of the right-wing parties, and that's happened in several European countries. I think Germany did well for a time. Sweden did well. Hungary, of course, is on the other side. They don't take any. Are there any countries? Well, there are. I mean, look, Jordan, for example. I went to a refugee camp in Jordan. 70,000 to 80,000 people in that camp. Electricity, sanitation, water, all that sort of stuff, and proper prefab buildings. But there's a big but, and this is one of my key messages. I talked to a Syrian boy. He said, I've just finished my education in the camp. That's good. I'm trying to get a job in the camp. I can't. I'm trying to get a job outside the camp. I can't. What do I do? And it's his lack of hope. In my belief, people can put up with terrible physical conditions if there's some hope for them at the end of the line. And one of our jobs is to give people hope. Nevertheless, Jordan's done a fairly decent job, and Lebanon, they've got difficulties there, but they've done a decent job. And there's some European countries that have done quite well. Look, we're not the worst, but we could do better.
Mm. The other country there was a session on a similar topic that I was at recently with Enver Solomon, who's now the CEO of the Refugee Council. He referenced Canada as well.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I have a lot of respect for Enver and the Refugee Council. We cooperate a great deal. We talk at intervals. And yes, I think Canada has a particularly good. For a time, the Americans did, but that stopped. That's stopped now. For a time, there was a time when Haitians were fleeing Haiti some years ago, and most Caribbean countries closed the door to them, and the Americans let them all land. So yes, but I think Canada, of the countries that are enlightened in some distance away, Canada has had a good record. We'll probably find some other countries as well, but and you know, the Irish have done pretty well. The Irish have been helpful, you know, in a small way, in a small country. The Irish have been helpful, and so it's not all doom and gloom.
We've come to the end. I just wanted, there've been so many great questions, but also lots of sort of comments of support for different organizations. One in particular was Safe Passage, that I know that you've been very involved in. Are there any organizations or causes or campaigns that you would like to sort of share as a way that people can take the fantastic sort of inspiration you've provided and take it forward?
Well, of course, the refugee council are doing a great job. Safe Passage are doing a great job. But although they don't work in northern France, Save the Children, Oxfam and those. Also, World Jewish Relief, that they do a good job. The Jewish Council for Community Relations, you probably know Edie Friedman, that they do a good job. So there are a lot of organisations that do a good job, and you just have to latch onto them and see how you can support them. But you mentioned Safe Passage, they're the ones I've been working closest with, and the Refugee Council, and you took the words out of my mouth.